Who was Marco Polo?
Marco Polo was born on September 15, 1254 in Venice, Italy. He died in January of 1324 in Venice, Italy. He was the son of Niccolo Polo and nephew of Maffeo Polo. He wrote an autobiography called The Travels of Marco Polo, or Il Milione. He provided inspiration for other explorers such as Christopher Columbus. He was inspired to travel by his mom's death in 1269. Journey to China.
Marco's father and uncle set sail from Constantinople to Crimea for trade. They received an invitation to Cathay to meet Kublai Khan. In 1265, they arrived at Kaifeng, the capital of Kublai Khan's Mongol Empire. They stayed until 1269 and returned to Europe with the request for the Pope to send 100 missionaries to the Mongol Empire. The message was relayed to the Pope, but he did not send the missionaries as requested. Marco Polo's first journey.
Marco accompanied his father and uncle to the Holy Land, Persia, Tartary, and to the Empire of China. The Polo family traveled across the Silk Road. In 1274 they reached Cathay and renewed their friendly acquaintance with Kublai Khan in Peking and presented him with papal letters. Marco's father and uncle were given important positions at his court. While here, Marco studied the Chinese language, which he learned to speak. The Polos' stay in China.
Marco Polo's voyage to China was important because it was land that the Europeans had never visited before. While in China, he was promoted to governor of the great Chinese city, Yangzhou.
In 1275, Marco was appointed as an envoy, or messenger or representative, for Kublai Khan and traveled through China. From then on, he was employed as an envoy for the Chinese monarch.
Polo family leaves China. In 1293, the three decide to make their way back to Venice. However, they escort Princess Cocochin to her wedding and the party after.
The fleet of ships that had the wedding party on it sailed southward on the China Sea. Stops were made at Borneo, Sumatra, Ceylon, and other places, including the Persian Gulf. They were entertained by the Persians for weeks and adorned with expensive gifts.
Polos arrived back in Venice.
They arrived back in Venice in 1295 with the finest collection of jewels. They were changed in appearance. They dressed in Tatar costume and spoke Chinese. It was hard to convince people they were members of the Polo family.
Upon their arrival, the Polos threw a lavish party dressed in Chinese garb. At the bottom of the robes, rubies, emeralds, and diamonds were sewn into the lining. In 1298, Marco Polo was made a gentleman commander of a Venetian galley.
Marco Polo was captured by the Genoese.
When Marco Polo returned from Cathay, Venice was at war with Genoa. They were fighting for the trade of the world. In a great naval battle, the Venetians were completely defeated by the Genoese. Marco Polo was involved in the battle and was captured by the enemy. Marco Polo dictates an account of his travels.
For a year he was confined to the Genoese prison. While here, Marco dictated his experiences to China, Japan, and other countries to a cellmate, who was a skillful penman. Copies of the manuscript exist today. One copy is in Paris and another is in Bern. The accounts were translated into many different languages, so everyone is aware of his travels. The impact of Marco Polo's travels on Europe.
Marco Polo's travels increased Europe's cultural knowledge of the East, in everyday lifestyle and also religion. Marco Polo's travels encouraged European geographic knowledge of the East. He also inspired the Age of Discovery. This encouraged Western exploration, which led to the first European voyages to the New World. Christopher Columbus also used Polo's accounts of his travels to help estimate the distance involved in sailing west to China.
Polo's system of measuring distances by days turned out to be very accurate for later generations. He impacted European map-making to reflect real physical geography. He brought back the compass to Europe. He also encouraged new trade routes. He shared inventions from the Far East, such as paper money, coal, which led to long-lasting heat, and gunpowder. The impact of Marco Polo's travels on today.
Marco Polo's work is considered the precursor of scientific geography. He was also the inspiration for the exploration of outer space in the 20th century. Marco Polo was the inspiration for international trade between the East and the West.
Here is a map of Marco Polo's travels between 1271 and 1295.
Children in the United States learned that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. But since there were already millions of people living on the American continents when he arrived, what is Columbus's real importance in history? This video will show what really happened during his voyages between two worlds and how they helped shape the world we know today. In 1451, Columbus was born in the Republic of Genoa. There he began his sailing career, but in 1477 he was hired as a merchant mariner for King John II of Portugal. Portugal was gaining power on the seas, colonizing Atlantic islands and establishing trade with African kingdoms. By the 1480s, they found out the Indian Ocean was on the other side of Africa. This discovery gave them a fast and cheap trade route to the rich goods of Asia. During Portugal's rise in power, a group of European scholars thought the Earth was smaller than what was previously believed. This meant one could reach Asia by sailing west. Because of the newly invented printing press, Columbus read about these recent theories and was enthralled with the idea of sailing west for riches. He tried to get funding for an expedition from Portugal, but King John didn't believe in the small Earth theory. He then tried in France, England, and Spain with no luck until 1492 when the Spanish sovereigns, Ferdinand and Isabella, decided to help fund 3 ships for a voyage. They saw Columbus as a means to compete against Portugal's success. The Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria set sail on August 3, 1492. After a stop on Gran Canaria, the rest of the trip took 5 weeks. On October 12th, land was spotted. It was an island, and at dawn Columbus went ashore. Because he believed in the small Earth theory, Columbus thought he was near Japan. He called the natives of this island Indians because India was what many Europeans called Asia at the time, but the natives were really called the Taino. Trade began between the two parties, but it was clear that the Taino did not possess the fabled riches of East Asia. However, some of them wore gold as jewelry. Columbus was hungry for gold to bring back to Spain. He wandered around searching for a large amount of gold until the Santa Maria crashed into a reef on Hispaniola. Columbus left 39 men at the site to build a colony. He promised he would return for them and sailed back to Spain. When he arrived in Europe, Columbus was famous. He had sailed into the unknown and returned to tell the tale. He brought back many things to show the Spanish king and queen, including Tainos he had kidnapped. But he did not bring enough gold, so Ferdinand and Isabella equipped Columbus with 17 ships for a second voyage, and named him governor of all the lands he discovered. Columbus was an excellent sailor. He found his way back to Hispaniola using his own keen navigation skills, and kept the coordinates of his route a secret. When the fleet arrived at Hispaniola, they found out that the 39 men who were left there to build a colony had been killed by a local chief. They also found out the same chief had lots of gold on his land. Columbus led a crew into his territory and found a gold quarry. The chief was angered by the arrogance of these invaders, and soon fighting broke out. To intimidate the chief, Columbus captured 3 of his captains and beheaded them in public. This enraged the Taínos and disturbed many of the Spanish. To make things worse, there was soon no gold left to mine. Columbus sent letters back to Spain on a ship and exaggerated the amount of gold that was found. To produce more profit for the king and queen, Columbus suggested starting a slave trade. Without waiting for a response, he seized over 500 natives and sent them to Spain. Most of the remaining natives fought against this injustice, so Columbus unleashed terror on them. Once defeated, they were forced to pay tributes of gold to the Spanish. It was worse than slavery. People who didn't find enough were punished brutally. Forced to constantly look for gold, the Taíno could not farm their lands anymore. Many escaped into the hills, only to be hunted down. During the first few years of the tribute system, 50,000 natives died. Columbus's brutal command made him enemies in the colony as well as in Europe. In 1496, he sailed for Spain to defend his actions to Ferdinand and Isabella. He left his brother Bartolomeo in charge of the colony until he returned. The king and queen listened to his defense and allowed him to return to Hispaniola in 1498. By now, the colony was a disaster. Bartolomeo was just as bad at governing as his brother was, if not worse. A rebellion had begun among the Spanish, and soon the king and queen sent a royal investigator to assess the situation. He put the Columbus brothers on trial. They were found guilty of numerous crimes against both the Spanish and the natives. The brothers were arrested and sent back to Spain. Christopher Columbus was no longer in charge of the New World. Now old and humbled, he was allowed one last voyage across the ocean, but he was not permitted to return to Hispaniola. He explored the Caribbean for 2 years before sailing back to Spain, where he died in 1506. We have learned that Columbus was ambitious, intelligent, and courageous, but he was no hero. His exploits in the colony were disasters for the native inhabitants, and their way of life was destroyed by his actions as governor. But his efforts led Europe to dominate the world through colonization and the expansion of kingdoms into empires. If Columbus did not succeed, someone else would have. But since his journey was the first to establish a link between the old world and the new, his name is remembered.